Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So welcome to this launch event for the Common Sense Policy Group's first report, Act Now, a vision for a better future and a new social contract. I'm Elliot Johnson, Senior Research Fellow in Public Policy at Northumbria University and a member of the group. We aren't expecting a fire alarm today, so in the event of one going off, please make your way through the fire exits and to the assembly point marked outside. As you'll know, many universities around the world have seen protests at their events relating to the conflict in the Middle East. We aren't expecting any disruption to today's events, but if there is any unscheduled activity, we'll deal with it peacefully and advise the audience on any actions to take. But back to the report. Act Now is available as a paperback for $9.99 in bookshops and online, but we also have a website, commonsensepolicygroup.com, where you can read summaries of the report and each policy area. We want this work to be available to everyone, regardless of means, and we'll continue to make it available in as many forms as possible. We thank Manchester University Press for their support in publishing this book at its low price and allowing us to disseminate its contents widely. We've committed to put any and all royalties back into further research. The cross-party Common Sense Policy Group comprises academics, policymakers, third sector leaders, community representatives, and media figures and people with lived experience. Act Now is a culmination of around a year of intensive, rigorous, and unprecedentedly rapid work to set out a policy platform that can rescue Britain from an era of perma-crisis and deliver a secure, equal, successful and hopeful society once again. Unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer of us who can remember the last time that the country felt like that. Act Now explains how we can rebuild Britain through a programme comparable to that which rebuilt the country after World War II. This is an evidence-based programme that is affordable, feasible and popular with the public. We appeal to the new government, and indeed all parties, to adopt these policies as part of its overarching vision of a decade of national renewal. Today you're going to hear from a series of speakers who will discuss the findings of the report and the importance of them to their own work, their stakeholders and their lives and Britain as a whole. This will take us to 4 p.m. and we will then have a half-hour Q&A session before closing. The Common Sense Policy Group and MUP have pulled out all the stops to ensure that the report could be published before the unexpectedly early general election. We did so because we know that in order to rebuild Britain, we must act now. First, we are very grateful to hear from Northumbria University's Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive, Andy Long.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm not going to pick the microphone up. So good afternoon and welcome guests to Northumbria University, colleagues. Well, you're always welcome here, but good to see everybody. It is a pleasure to see Northumbria colleagues collaborating with leading experts across the UK, along with policymakers and third sector organisations, around such an important topic. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all today to the launch of Act Now, a vision for a better future and a new social contract. Northumbria University holds a unique place in UK higher education. Through our world-leading research and transformative education, we enable people from all backgrounds to succeed and support businesses and communities in the North East and beyond to thrive. Now, these are challenging times, and at Northumbria University we're committed to research that addresses poverty and inequality, particularly through our significant investment in the Centre for Health and Social Equity, or CHASE, on our city centre campus. We're dedicated to working in partnership with communities and community organisations, and this work embodies that spirit. We're proud that 40% of Northumbria's student population comes from underrepresented backgrounds, as in students from areas with low rates of participation in higher education, I think often better referred to as under-resourced backgrounds. And nearly 3% of our students are care leavers, and I believe we have the highest total number of students who are care leavers of any university in the country. We provide these students with an education in a research-intensive environment, and it yields outcomes now comparable to the highest-ranking universities in the sector. The Problems of our age are undoubtedly require innovation, evidence-based approaches to unlock them. Given the relevance of this work to so many of our students and our communities, and given the role that Northumbria plays, I'm personally proud that Northumbria is hosting this event and also continues to support research that seeks out new solutions. Now, I must apologise with you that I can't stay for the whole event. It is not a lack of interest, and it is certainly nothing to do with anything anybody says at the point that I leave the room. It is because I'm hosting a graduation ceremony later today, and I'll be very interested to hear from those of you that can stay about the conversations that you've had today. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy a productive and inspiring afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for joining us. It's really great that you're able to come today. Next up is Louise Bracken, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Knowledge Exchange.
Hi, thank you. That's very kind. And I often always follow Andy. But really, I mean, what I wanted to really emphasise with you, and they've asked me to really talk about, is really, our commitment to this type of research. And when I say this type of research, I mean the interdisciplinary nature of this research, and really, depending on your definitions, you might say the transdisciplinary nature of this, because it isn't just with academia, it is with practice, it's to inform practice. And I think this is something that we do at Northumbria really, really well. So we invest in interdisciplinary research. We have what we call interdisciplinary research themes. We've done a lot of work on deciding what they are and that they have a life, and we give birth to some, and then they roll off and become our business as usual. But also, the department have been brilliant at thinking about their research groups, at that fundamental unit of supporting research. And that isn't just from within us, that is with external people. So it's brilliant. And I feel really privileged in my role because I get to know researchers, and I not everybody as well as I might like, but I have engaged with some of our internal people a bit, and it's just amazing to get to know our researchers, the departments, and the type of work they're doing, and particularly something like this that is interdisciplinary, that is here to change the country, and to be here at the launch, I think, to celebrate that is really exciting. So we obviously invest in this research, and it is a time, I suppose, where social science is getting a lot of criticism about its usefulness, its value in the market. So I think today, and the launch of this, is a real reminder of that value and the influence that can have at a time, as we've already talked about, that it is really necessary. So we're very lucky with this project team. That we have got leading figures from a range of disciplines whose insights from, for example, and I read this bit because I can't remember it all, public health, medicine, environmental science and psychology, and the way they've been integrated, I think, to do that thought leadership, but also test, microsimulate by a policy-making group within the Department of Social Work, Education and Community Wellbeing. And I know the department's really invested and supported this, which I think that the team are all really grateful for. And I think really this is one highlight of many in a commitment to our ambitious world-leading research, and we really are driving that. But this report in itself is really one of the first to combine that modelling of such a wide range of policies in one single programme with innovative public opinion, evaluation, and involving large-scale and partly co-produced survey of perspectives across the whole country. So it is really exciting to be here at the launch. We will still be, and the team will still be doing, thinking about adoption, not just informing, but thinking about that adoption and what it means further. So, it is very exciting to be here, as Andy says. This is ambitious. It's really important that we maintain here at Northumbria to be ambitious and have that vibrant university sector, and that we fully support our social science amongst a whole range of disciplines that we do. So the report sets out a number of pragmatic reforms that can address the challenges we face within the sector and beyond. And as we look beyond this Parliament into the next, these proposals will give us food for thought about what might be possible. So it's brilliant to be here for the launch. I hope you continue to engage in this debate beyond today. I'll be supporting that in my role, the university will. So thank you. I too will have to disappear about 4:45, but I'll be able to stay till then. So congratulations to all of you. It's brilliant to be here. Thank you.
I'd just like to say thanks, Louise, and I think we can all say that there is a great level of support within Northumbria for this work. That isn't necessarily the case in everywhere. So it's a really unique thing about Northumbria that I think has been incredibly helpful in pushing this work forward. So the remaining speakers are all members of the Common Sense Policy Group. We're next going to hear from Matthew Johnson, Professor of Public Policy at Northumbria University and Chair of the Common Sense Policy Group. His work focuses on the importance of people's material conditions to political preferences.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody, for attending. It's just such a privilege to be with you all today, and it's such a privilege to work for Northumbria. And it might sound sycophantic in ways that we're unused to these days, but Northumbria is our city's university. It serves our region, and the sort of work that we're able to do as a result of the commitment that the senior leadership, as well as our departmental leadership, puts into research is really quite significant, as I mentioned. I think it's probably incumbent upon me, having worked with such an incredible group of colleagues, to thank those colleagues for the incredible patience, resilience, hard work and intelligence that's gone into this work. It's always nice to be a parasitic beneficiary of clever people's work, and I'm surrounded by clever people, and I continue to enjoy working with those clever people. I think it's also important to thank two people in particular. First person is Joanne Atkinson, our head of department, who is the most naturally suited to being head of department of any person I've ever met. She's just fantastic. We need to keep her. And the second person is Gemma Brown, who, again, is our brilliant press officer who we really need to keep in post. Gemma is way too good for us. God knows how we've managed to get Gemma's support, but we've been supported all the way through, and I think it's absolutely essential we recognise that support and cherish it in every event like this. So what then about Act Now? Well, the reason for Act Now is that we really do have to act now in order to avoid much worse outcomes. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a particular diminution in outcomes across the country, but that stems back maybe till 2010, or maybe back until the early 80s. The reforms that have been implemented in this country have sadly produced worsening crises that really will get critically bad over the next few years unless we do act now. And in order to understand how the world could be, how Britain could be, we need to think about how it was. So who here has watched One Foot in the Grave? Anyone not watched One Foot in the Grave? Anyone not understand the premise of One Foot in the Grave? I'm very old now, I can remember the first episode of One Foot in the Grave. One Foot in the Grave, the premise of the sitcom is a 59-year-old man is about to retire. And he retires at 59 as a security guard, and retires to his wife, who works as a florist, to their detached home in the southeast of England. And at the time, that was perfectly plausible. You could have people working in unskilled professions, technically, without higher education or whatever, owning their own homes in the southeast of England, and being able to retire at 60. If a sitcom were to be developed along those lines today, it would be fantastical. Absolutely ridiculous. The house that the Meldrews lived in, that's interesting, the house that the Meldrews lived in 1990 was probably worth £1 million these days. So you kind of think, well, what's happened? Why is it that we've, over the course of 35 years, gone from a position in which pretty much everybody can own a house, pretty much everybody can support themselves on whatever job they're doing, to a condition now where it's almost impossible for young people to buy their own homes, even in parts of the country like our own, where house prices are lower. And the reality is that, very sadly, there has been a short-termism in public policy that has benefited particular age groups over the last 45 years. So pretty much every domestic public policy that has been directed at redistribution of resources has benefited baby boomers more than any other group overall. It's really interesting. So you think about the 1979 election. That was an election that was won on the support of young people. The Thatcher years were won on the support of young people. And throughout that period, the wealth, the assets of that age group massively increased, more than perhaps any previous generation in British history. And they increased much quicker than their parents' wealth, and they increased much quicker than their children's wealth. The long-term impacts of that are just being felt now. And they're being felt not just in terms of an unequal distribution of wealth across the generations, but also in voting patterns. Andy, could you put the figure on, please? The image. Where is Andy? He's remote. Andy, can you put the... Please, Andy! I'm dying here. Put the image on. Oh, right, okay. Voting by age. Yeah, doesn't matter. Basically, voting by age group is today unlike it was in 1997. The proportion of older voters who are voting Labour is massively smaller than it was in 1997. In fact, in 1997, the distribution of votes was fairly consistent across the age groups. And you kind of think, well, what's the reason for this? And there's a pathologisation of older people that's unhelpful, I think. The reason for it is that the lived experience of older people is just completely different to the lived experience of people under 50. In essence, the wealth, the illiquid assets as well as the liquid assets that older people gained during the 80s, 90s and 2000s give them a degree of financial security that younger people just do not have access to. And you see that in explaining the public preferences across the 10 policy areas within Act Now. The key determinant of whether somebody wants to endorse a public policy that redistributes resources is their perceived exposure to risk of destitution. And because perceived risk of destitution is so closely correlated with age and perceived risk of destitution explain pretty much most of the public policy preferences that we see at play in the previous election and we'll see across the next election. So what does that do? Well, it creates a demographic time bomb. Because what we've got is a situation in which the current government has spent the previous 5 years in opposition appealing to older voters and has seen the vast majority of those older voters that it targeted voting for the Conservatives and Reform regardless. And one of the predictions that ultimately didn't come to fruition, but it was borne out by the evidence, was that we would probably see a hung parliament or a small Labour majority. And had Nigel Farage not stood, I think it was perfectly possible on the basis of turnout that would have been the case. What we see is a third of the electorate, a third of all votes were for the current government. And what we see next time, perfectly plausibly, is a centre-right, a right, that isn't split. And if it's not split, the current government faces a good chance of being voted out of office. But if it acts now, if it's bold, if it does what it needs to do in order to invest in our communities, in order to reduce inequality, in order to secure the social determinants of all of these outcomes in health, education, employment, crime, that it can secure through this policy programme, it stands a very real chance of winning over a generation of voters, getting people to vote, and getting people to vote for these policies long term. That's what the Conservatives did in 1979. The level of support for the Conservatives has been long-standing precisely because the Conservatives, even over the last 14 years, have insulated older people from the risk of destitution that many more in our society have faced, and faced much more brutally. So what we call for is the government to act in its own interest. This is a policy programme that is feasible, demonstrably affordable, Howard's going to talk to that, and demonstrably popular. It has the support of the vast majority of people who voted in the last election. It has certainly a plurality of support among Conservatives. The policies that we present here are common sense. We cannot go on having our infrastructure owned by by companies, organisations, states that do not have our best interests at heart. We have to secure our society, and that means investment. There's a clear pathway to do that through this book. Thank you.
So, by video, we are now going to hear from Kate Pickett, Professor of Epidemiology at the University of York, and with Richard Wilkinson, best-selling author of The Spirit Level and Inner Level. Her work focuses on the importance of reducing inequality in order to achieve better outcomes. And either we're going to get this done remotely, or I'm going to have to play the video now. I'll play it.
Good evening.
Oh.
I'm Kate Pickett. I'm Professor of Epidemiology at the University of York, and I'm one of the members of the Common Sense Policy Group. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you this evening. I'm actually on the other side of the Pentlands, working with a group that are trying to tackle health inequalities in this country. It's one of the biggest issues facing us. Our country is driven by huge differences in life expectancy, in chronic illness, in infant mortality, obesity, and mental health problems. But health inequalities aren't the only big problem we have in the UK. We have out of control levels of poverty. We are the most unequal country in Western Europe. We have high levels of stress, high levels of crime and incivility. We have hunger on a scale that I would not have imagined possible when I returned to this country after 16 years working abroad. And I think perhaps one of the biggest problems facing us that's related to all these different conditions, but also stands alone, is how precarious everybody feels. 0 hours contracts, the gig economy, people not actually being able to rely on their incomes or their benefits with the level of conditionality that's been imposed with 14 years of austerity. And when people don't have a secure, stable, material ground to stand on, then they're unable to take risks, invest in their own futures, think about doing things differently for themselves and their families. They really lack a very basic security. And for all of these reasons, the number one policy that we're calling for in Act Now is the implementation of a universal basic income for all permanent residents in the UK. We're calling for a starter scheme where adults will receive £75 per week and children will receive £50 a week. This is affordable. It can be done with very minimal adjustments in tax and no additional borrowing. And we know that it's feasible for a government to operationalise something like this. We saw that with the furlough scheme during the pandemic, that government can mobilise to give money to people when it's needed. So we know it could work, and we know we can afford it. And people actually want it. Our polls suggest very much so that they do. 71.5% of people in the regular constituencies would like to see a universal basic income. That includes 61.6% of those who are planning to vote for the Conservatives in the past election and 80% of those who are planning to vote for Labour. Nationally, 69% of people say they would like to see a universal basic income, and that's more than half of those who are planning to vote for the Conservatives and 75% of those who are planning to vote for Labour. To people who say, oh, well, British people will not tolerate tax increases, we do know from our survey work that they will be willing to accept tax increases if they're assured that that is going to lead to poverty reduction. And with our starter universal basic income scheme, we would see child poverty in this country reduced by more than half and reduced by 23% for adults. That's a huge boom. It would actually pay off in multiple ways, with people being more productive, healthier, more secure, able to do things So there would be a real benefit to society from even that very modest starter scheme. We suggest in the book that this could be increased over 5 years to give people a higher amount, and by 10 years we could actually be thinking about providing a universal basic income that meets minimum income standards for everybody in the UK. And that's why this is our #1 policy call. It will do the most to free up people, make them feel that they're part of an equal society, that they're valued by society. It will restore dignity to people, and it will give people that solid material floor. UBI used to be a fringe idea, now it's a really central idea. It used to be something that perhaps felt a bit wacky, now it really feels like common sense. And it's something that the government could enact now to make life better for everybody in this country. I know that other people are going to be talking about our other policy suggestions, the other things that we're calling for in Act Now. But universal basic income is the first policy that we believe should be enacted, because that will give the social security to everybody in this country, and it will pay off in multiple ways. So again, I'm really sorry not to be with you tonight. All of the policies that you're going to hear about will help increase equality in the UK, promote freedom from domination, they'll tackle the social determinants of health and build community wealth, and they'll help to level up places. So it is common sense, and we should act now. Have a good evening.
And I think just to build on that, I think it's really important to note that a lot of people who felt at risk of destitution in the past, that people who didn't feel at risk of destitution in the past now do. There are people who are even higher earners who are suddenly experiencing what that's like for the first time. This is a really big problem that we need to tackle, and that's why that is such an important policy to the platform. So next up is Danny Dorling, who's Halford's Mackinder Professor of Geography and a Fellow at St Peter's College, Oxford. In 2023, he published Shattered Nation, Inequality and the Geography of the Failing State. His work concerns issues of housing, health, employment, education, wealth and poverty. Thanks, Danny.
I want to see myself. Thank you very much. It was great to follow Kate. Apparently recorded in her toilet, I hear. Anyway, there were two things that Matthew said that struck a chord with me. The first was when he referred to people under 50 as being young, which was when I suddenly realised, okay, I am old. And the second was how we are in the University of the City and the Region. Now, in 1986, I came to the other university in this city, which, and I won't not being unfair, I like it very much, stayed 10 years, but if you like, back then, the university for educating soft southern people about the north of England. I arrived in Newcastle, and most other students, certainly in the geography department, were from the south of England. And this was a different place. I stayed for 10 years, and it was probably my real education, because I grew up in Oxford. And those times were very, very different. In the 1970s, we had full employment in the south. Even in the early 80s, we had full employment in the south of England. It's where, 1 foot in the grave, you could do that, whereas you couldn't do it so much up here. If you're wondering, how do we get to this state? How is it actually possible? A lot of the answers, I think, are geographical. It was just chance that I came north. My second choice was SOAS in London, to be trendy and whatever. Luckily, I got my A-levels and I got up here. But I'm exactly the right age to have done the opposite trip to people like, I think, David Cameron and Johnson and Sunak, Tony Blair, all coming into my home city at the same time, and then all going to work in London, and not seeing what was happening outside, living different lives. Rachel Reeves, she turns up at St John's College, Oxford, a bit younger than me, goes to work for the Bank of England, isn't outside. Keir Starmer goes to a rather exclusive school, more exclusive than mine, goes off to Leeds, then comes to Oxford to Teddy Hall in London. So if you're sort of thinking, how on earth could we have got to a situation in which we have the greatest economic inequality in all of Europe, occasionally bar Bulgaria, and the poorest fifth of people in this country are poorer than the majority of the poorest fifth in all of Eastern Europe? It's that geographical dislocation of simply not seeing, not understanding, not realising how bad things were getting. Why should you be interested in this particular book? Or what's different about it for those of you who think you've seen this kind of thing before? Talking to my over 50-year-olds in the audience. There are two things which are particularly unusual about Act Now. The first, from a point of view of being involved in this, is that there is a huge number of people involved, and we didn't all put our names to individual bits and chapters. Right? We were, thanks to the brilliant editing of this, basically said, your name will be on there somewhere, but it's too serious now to kind of argue, oh, I think this is right and not this, and so on. So it's a collaboration which is far more readable, exciting, less point scoring between areas than I have ever seen before, and certainly a larger group of people involved. And the other side of it, everywhere I look at Act Now, is it's rather like a manifesto. Except a manifesto is only 25,000 words and has to be bland, because you can't say things that will scare people. And the key points in a manifesto are the lines you put in when you want to tell the House of Lords, yes, I can do this because it's in the manifesto. Now, tragically, those lines are not in the Labour Party manifesto. You might argue, but that's the things that worry me. Whereas this, if you like, is a what would you actually do or think of doing or reserve the right to do if the circumstances require it, so that the Lords can't stop you doing it. So it's part manifesto, but better costed than the 2017 and 2019 Labour manifestos, and more detail. Why Act Now on everything? Because you can't sort it out one thing at a time. You can't just go to the private house builders and say, you know, don't worry, I'll get rid of the regulations on the newts and let you build everywhere, and that'll work. Right? You can't just say to the health service, we'll come to some deal over junior doctors and then we'll not have a crisis of staffing. It's all connected. The problems of staffing the NHS in many parts of the country are you simply can't afford to live there. Yeah, that's our issue. You have to do many things at once. I'll wrap up in 60 seconds. I'm not going to talk to you about the housing chapter, which I was mostly involved in, but so far I'm not particularly excited by what's happening with this current government with housing. I think I recognise exactly what it is, because for years I was invited to the party conferences to sit at the meetings in the small room with the house builders, Persimmons, Barrett and so on, the Secretary of State for Housing or the Shadow Minister for Housing, and at the end of the table was the token academic who worried about social housing. That was me. And the house builders who were paying for the drinks would be around the minister wanting to get their way. That is what we are currently seeing with policy this week. But there are lots of things going wrong. The government that's just come into power has been told a list of things about to go wrong. Not quite sure which one it will be first, but it doesn't look good, and most of them you could have predicted anyway. So their current programme, which appears and was formulated very much in secret. Most Labour MPs don't know what the programme is. Some of them don't even know where their constituencies are, but they're going to them for the first time. They don't know what the programme is. The programme was about trying to win. There was absolutely fear of not winning. It was only in May this year that the Sky poll said it could be a hung parliament on the basis of the local election results. It is only because reform has stood in almost every seat that Labour can secure so many seats despite having fewer votes than 2019. It's the most bizarre of circumstances we find ourselves in, and frightening. It's frightening to have a far right party doing so well. The Conservative Party were already a far-right party. They'd aligned themselves with Alternative for Deutschland in Europe before we left the EU. So these things are scary, but why be optimistic? You have the biggest Labour majority since 1997. The country is far poorer than it was in 1997. The majority of those members of Parliament cannot be government ministers. You could create a few dozen more junior minister posts, but still you just can't do it. So the majority of Labour members of Parliament are going to be on the back benches for the next few years. And the majority of them will go to their constituency every Friday and do their surgeries. And their constituencies are now the poorest places on this continent. And you think you're going to be able to tell your party members that change is going to take decades after decades when they have been elected to represent those people, and you can't buy them off with a minister's job in government because you can't create enough ministerial posts in government. That is where we are for the next few years, facing the threat of a country that's moved further and further and further to the right, and now has Reform and the Conservatives between them, with a large share of the vote, which only looks really bad for them because they split it absolutely, very similar to how Labour and the SDP did in 1983. The people at the top really should not be stupid. They were largely isolated from what happened because of their personal lives and the geography that they lived through. But the fear, the chances of being destitute have spread. People laughed when Jeremy Hunt gave sympathy to families on £100,000 in Surrey. And Jeremy Hunt is a particularly unconnected man to society. But still, trying to get by in Surrey is not that easy. The last fact I'll give you about how much things can change, just so you don't think nothing can change, is when I came up here as a child in 1986. This wasn't the poorest part of the UK. That was Scotland. The highest child poverty rate in Europe was in Glasgow. The highest infant mortality rate in Western Europe was in Glasgow. Now Scotland has a lower official child poverty rate than the southeast of England and than Surrey. Things change. They really do. The question is, which way do you want to change them? And how long people will tolerate being told the same story. Don't worry, growth will eventually come, then we'll have trickle down. It doesn't work as a message anymore, which is why this book was needed. Thank you very much.
Very much, Danny. So we'll now hear from Richard Wilkinson, who is visiting professor in social work education and community wellbeing at Northumbria University. Alongside Kate, he's the best-selling author of The Spirit Level and Inner Level, and pioneered understanding of the impact of inequality on health.
Thank you. I feel one thing that needs to be said, that Matthew is really under-recognised. If you look at the cover of the book, he's not mentioned Danny, Kate and I are mentioned, I certainly don't deserve to be. At least they've made decent contributions. I've made a few comments. This book wouldn't have existed without Matthew pushing it through. Really, the credit should go to him. I think it's a book that will become more important as the Labour Party faces the difficulties it's tied itself into with the restrictions on the taxes it's willing to change and so on. And the importance of a really integrated policy programme which is properly concentrated, which is properly costed by Howard, I think will be seen to be more important as the difficulties of the present government become more apparent. I'm as old as President Biden. There was some sort of punchline meant to go with that. I can't remember what it is. But at least I'm not applying for President of the United States, but I have the same memory problems. As Kate said, the chapter 2 in this book puts 5 principles against which we should assess policy. They're all to do with greater equality. The first is about, will it increase equality? The second, will it promote freedom from domination in housing and employment and elsewhere? And those are essentially about equality. Will it tackle the social determinants of health, the huge health inequalities, the extremes between different postcode areas, are at least 19-year differences in life expectancy. As I used to say when they were a lot smaller, that's a social injustice worse than locking people up without trial. Since we first started to focus research on these inequalities in health, they first became clearly known, at least in the research and policy community. They haven't got smaller, they've got bigger. It really, and to talk about social justice and to live in a society where so little is done about those things is absolutely shocking. The fourth one of those assessment criteria, will it build community wealth? That's the Preston model, having anchor groups getting public institutions to spend more of their money locally and so on, to keep money in the area, to develop and reduce inequalities between areas. That's the fifth one, levelling up places. I don't think people realise how expensive inequality is. The Equality Trust did a little exercise a while ago, I think actually only a year or 18 months ago, and it made a quite reasonable basis. It costed mental illness, homicide, imprisonment associated with Britain having higher inequality than I think the 23 richer members of the OECD. So if we move to that average, rather than being much more unequal than those countries, we would save just on those items, mental illness, homicide, imprisonment, and poorer healthy life expectancy, they estimated 106 billion. If you were to add in some kind of costing, and I don't know how you would do it, the damage of the destruction of social cohesion that inequality produces, the lowering of trust, the lowering of kids' maths and literacy scores, higher obesity rates, and lower social mobility that, of course, lower social mobility means we're even further away from equal opportunities for children. And people who talk about whether we're interested in equalities of outcome or equalities of opportunity, it's not a choice. You can't have equalities of opportunity for children while you have huge inequalities of outcome amongst their parents. Parents will always find ways of passing on their advantages or passing on their disadvantages to their children. And so the only way of having greater moving towards equality of opportunities for children is to have equality in the society more generally. I think actually the effects of inequality are so widespread in our society. Basically all the problems that are more common lower down the social scale become more common throughout society in more unequal societies. So violence, poor health, low educational performance, all those kinds of things, they don't just get the biggest effects of inequality amongst the poor, but they affect even, to a lesser degree, middle-class people on reasonable incomes with jobs and so on. And because the effects are so widespread, it's really expensive to have decent, it's almost prohibitively expensive to have decent public services with high inequality. The demands, and it's a bit like having decent public services, decent welfare benefits if you have very high unemployment. You've got to get those things right, basically, to make it manageable. Inequality makes class differences worse. It makes status more important. The divisiveness of it. And basically, I'm often saying it turns us from a society that has a sort of shallow social pyramid like that to a society with a much steeper social pyramid like that. If you like, the material differences between us create the social distances between us. And with that, the feelings of superiority and inferiority increase. That's its divisiveness. Everyone, at least, pays lip service to the idea that we don't like class differences, but this is the basis of class differences when you get prime ministers like what John Major saying on the steps of Downing Street, he was going to create a classless society. That's absolute pie in the sky if you don't do anything about the material differences between us. Starmer will be hamstringing himself unless he tackles those, not just marginally, but quite radically, because the growth of inequality has been so enormous. Matthew referred to most of us not being old enough to remember when these differences were smaller. I am old enough to remember when they were smaller. And the whole society has become more antisocial since my student years, for instance. So many effects on our society. And it's worrying that most people don't know what society was like. Or how it could be, what feels different about it. I sometimes talk about when going to, Scandinavian countries to talk, and you just feel you feel more relaxed. You don't have to be aware of who is on the street as you walk home at night round you. Women don't have to be as worried and wary of that sort of thing. In big cities, in more unequal countries, that really matters. And you notice that sort of tension. I think since our spirit level book in, when was it, I can't remember, 2008 or 9 came out, and seemed to us to get unimaginable attention for an academic book. It took us so much by surprise. But despite that, I think people have forgotten the evidence that so many problems are related to inequality and don't understand the mechanism. I think perhaps what has changed is people are aware that inequality isn't just about a fairer share slices of the national pie, that it does something psychosocially, as I say, increasing class and the importance of class and status and the damage they do. But we do know a lot about the mechanisms, the social mechanisms. For instance, homicide becomes more common in more unequal societies because it's triggered by disrespect, loss of face, humiliation. So where status is more important, those things cause more problems. Health is related because inequality acts as a social stressor, and we now know how important stress is to all sorts of biological systems, including cardiovascular and immune systems. Mental illness, we know more about what's called the dominance behavioural system and how a number of mental illnesses are more common in more unequal societies and are triggered by issues to do with status. Imprisonment.
Without the disrespect aspect you just talked about.
Okay. Imprisonment is important. It's one of the closest relationships with inequality, and of course government is facing that now. Social mobility, I think you can understand from the importance of class and status increasing, and so social mobility going down. We're less likely to marry someone from a different class. Residential segregation goes up. All those divisive things show the effects. Kids' educational performance, poorer environmental performance, we now know is closely related, and of course the super rich bear much the biggest responsibility for CO2 emissions. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Richard has an entire career of work on this, so do go and listen to his TED talk in particular on YouTube. That's a really good place to start, but his contribution across his career has been incredible, and we're very fortunate to have him at Northumbria. So Howard Reid is next. He's Senior Research Fellow in Public Policy at Northumbria University, Director of Land and Economics, and former Senior Economist at the think tanks IPPR and IFS. Howard led the economic assessment of the policy programme and brings the kind of rigour to this sort of programme that's essential to its credibility and potential for adoption by government.
Thanks, Elliot. I'm going to discuss, I think it's the penultimate chapter of Act Now, which is called A New Economy with a Fully Costed and Funded Plan. It brings together all the spending commitments in the previous chapters. There's about 10 or 15 in each chapter, and there's about like 10 chapters. So there's a lot of policy commitments in Act Now, deliberately so, because it's an ambitious programme. What we wanted to do in this New Economy chapter was to show that the whole thing is fundable and affordable, and all that's lacking really is the political will to implement it. So, as Danny said, this kind of idealised manifesto, it's costed better than any manifesto I've seen. But I'll take you through some of the key measures on the tax side first. There's about 8 key measures. There's others, but the most important ones in terms of fiscal size. On income tax, we recommend increasing all rates by 3%, so not huge increases, but also reducing the personal allowance from the current level of £12,500, I think, to £800 per year, and that's mainly used to fund basic income, which I'll talk about in a minute. We also fold employee and self-employed national insurance contributions into income tax, so we've got a kind of combined schedule, which is a basic rate of 35%, higher rate for people with gross incomes of just above 50,000, 45% marginal rate, and then a marginal rate, additional rate above 125,000 of 50%. And that the total revenue gain from those income tax reforms is about £160 billion a year. So very substantial increases. But actually, the bulk of what we raise, because the overall package raises, the initial package is costed to raise about £340 billion per year. So over half of the additional tax revenue comes not from income but from tax on wealth, carbon emissions and corporate profits. So we have we propose introducing a wealth tax which would run at 2% per year for households with wealth above £2 million, with progressively higher rates at higher levels. People with wealth under £2 million wouldn't pay anything in that scheme. Carbon tax around £60 per tonne initially, rising to £75 per tonne by 2030. Luxury consumption taxes on frequent flyers and private jets. Reversing the huge real terms cuts in fuel duty that we've seen every year since 2010. It remains to be seen whether Labour will stick with that. But just reversing, so just taking fuel duty back in real terms to where it was in 2010, raises £20 billion per year of extra revenue. Headline rate of corporation tax, we propose putting it back up to 30%, which is where it was in the late 1990s. That raised about £12 billion per year. Local tax, which is currently a pretty regressive system, council tax in England, Wales and Scotland, where the amount you pay is lower as a percentage of your house price as you know, for people in houses that are worth more. We propose replacing that with a proportional property tax, which, as you may have guessed from the name, what you pay is basically a percentage of your property value, but also revalue all properties, which haven't been revalued in England and Scotland since 1991. So, you know, we're kind of replacing a tax that's like 35 years out of date. And a 0.95% local proportional property tax per year in England, with a double rate for second homes and empty properties. We reckon that would raise about £9 billion per year. And we'd also, the other key component is removing a huge number of unnecessary or badly targeted reliefs in the tax system. HMRC's got a huge list of these reliefs, and we reckon you could raise around £74 billion per year just by kind of knocking out the ones that aren't really doing anything useful. So that's an overall tax raising potential of £340 billion per year. And in terms of the spending commitments that we're funding with that, Kate's already talked about UBI, the starter scheme. The starter scheme starts off at a gross cost of £183 billion per year. Our intention within 5 years would be to move up towards a scheme which is kind of halfway towards the minimum income standard level. That's the level that researchers at the University of Loughborough have calculated is necessary for adults and children to play a kind of integral role in society and not be socially excluded. For that, you need to get halfway there. You need a payment of £190 per week for working age adults, £205 per week, I think, for pensioners, which is just above the current full level of the new state pension for somebody with a full contributions record, and £75 per week per child. That costs around £400 billion total, so it's another £215 billion or so on top of the starter scheme. So the gross cost is expensive, but we show that it can be met. I'll say more about that in a minute. A lot of other spending commitments that are mainly capital investment and repairing public services and utilities that are in a dreadful state at the moment. £28 billion per year, decarbonising the energy supply. That was a Labour commitment until it was unfortunately dropped earlier this year, along with a lot of other stuff. Retraining and relocation for workers in high carbon industries. We have a thing called the quadruple lock, which shows that people in those polluting industries won't lose out as they're retrained for kind of more socially useful industries. Retrofitting and improving the housing stock and investing more in social housing, new build. That's about £10 billion per year total expenditure commitment. Buying back the rest of the national grid, British Gas, renationalising water, rail, they're all commitments in the book. An extra almost £70 billion per year for the NHS to put the path of expenditure back on its long-term growth rate since the 1950s. The spending's really been held down over the last 15 years in austerity, and that explains why waiting lists are so high and the service is in such a state. So reversing that, and also an extra £20 billion or so per year of social care funding, because social care, if anything, in an even worse state than the NHS, because it wasn't well funded in 2010, and it's threadbare now. So those are really important spending commitments. Extending free school meals to all primary and secondary school children, and an extra £13 billion per year for public transport investment to create integrated transport systems around the country. There's a good chapter in the book by Jamie Driscoll, who you may have heard of in this region because he was a candidate for mayor, and he kind of makes some really good suggestions there. One really good positive knock-on impact of this extra capital investment spending is that it basically grows the economy. We estimate, based on previous estimates from researchers at UCL looking at the multiplier impacts of investment spending across a whole number of European countries, we reckon there's a 2.7 multiplier for capital investment. That means that for every £1 billion of extra capital investment the government makes, it gets £2.7 billion back in terms of increased GDP. And that means that overall, when we cost our programme, we generate about £206 billion a year extra in tax receipts on top of the £340 billion per year that we initially estimate. So that means that, with almost £550 billion per year to play with, we can increase universal basic income to that halfway to minimum income standard scheme, £190 per week for working age adults. And we have about £20 billion extra to play with after we've done that, so we could either reduce other taxes or address other areas where extra spending is needed. The final thing I'll note about this is it's important that the combination of the tax increases taken in isolation look like we're really kind of whacking people in terms of reduction in disposable income. But when you combine that, but it doesn't actually do that, when you combine it with the basic income payments and the huge increased spending on services, in terms of the amount of disposable income that people in the low to middle part of the income distribution will be getting on average as a result of this plan, plus the extra service quality and that they're receiving. It's a substantial transfer of resources to people on low to medium incomes. There's also a substantial increase in the amount of kind of uncommitted income that people have got after they've had to pay for essential services like rent and water, other utilities bills. The idea is that people have more money in their pocket, partly because we're reducing the extent to which people can be ripped off through those utility bills because we're renationalising, and we're basically, hopefully rents would decrease as well, and it's basically a really good redistributive programme kind of across the board. So it's really important to just emphasise that, and that's probably all I've got time for, but that's the kind of economics of Act Now in a nutshell. Thank you very much.
I think to build on the back of that, what this is a move away from the kind of passive wealth that has come to define this country. This is about rewarding hard work, and these reforms are about a net benefit to working families. This is what the government speaks of. This is not something that's clobbering people. This is a new way of doing things. That's treating the country a bit more like a business that many governments have spoken about, investing so that we get returns later. We can't keep just trying to plug the bucket as it's leaking. So finally, we have Lena. Lena Swedlow's campaigns and project officer at the cross-party progressive think tank and campaigning organisation Compass. She's been working on planning and powering Compass's campaigns, including Winners One. Lena has also been awarded a 9DTP studentship to examine the relationship between socio-economic status and political preferences from the data set resulting from Act Now. And she's going to speak to the relevance of Act Now to voters. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for having me along. Fantastic to be here and be part of the project that is this book. I'm going to speak off the back of a crazy 6-week election campaign and what just happened. And actually, I think defend the government a little bit, which is not my normal position. But I just want to say, I started off working, I was politicised in Scotland when I was 16. I was politicised by the independence referendum, which was about democracy and democratic rights. And I guess what I'm going to try and do in the next 5 minutes is connect democratic injustice to the economic injustices that we've been talking about. Because everything that we've heard, you can see directly impacts the material circumstances of people around the country and directly speaks to the inequality that they're facing. And a lot of times, I think, democratic reforms and constitutional reform is kind of seen as separate to that. And I think what was so interesting about the Scottish independence referendum is that it was one and the same. It was very clear to everyone, without anyone having to argue for it, that campaign and that constitutional reform was about the economy, it was about our borders, it was about the climate, it was about our educational system, and that was all part of the debate. And sometimes I think that does get lost, and we are in the last chapter, and it is very much included in Act Now, but I'm really keen to see this as part and parcel of a redistributive programme. I spend a lot of time in that vein thinking about the incentives that our current political structure has for both voters and also for politicians. The how and the what of politics are really never separate, and I think we had a really clear example of that. We just got, as you've mentioned, a Labour landslide on 34% of the vote. And as frustrating as we might find the current Labour leadership and the current government, and the failures of their imagination or talent. The reason that we have, the lowest turnout since universal suffrage and this political elite that doesn't really seem interested in democracy or interested in what serves people, largely, is because they don't need to. The voting system and the political system as it is does not incentivise them to care about those things and these people and most voters. It incentivises them to think about predominantly old, predominantly white, predominantly suburban voters, and that's how you win a landslide of 412 votes on 34% of the vote. Seats on 34% of the vote. It's these very short-term incentives that you talked about, and very centralising. Decisions are made in Whitehall, in Westminster, by technocrats and civil servants rather than people on the ground doing work. And they're mostly tweaks. It's not a redistributive policy like this. And so I would say it's part and parcel to change the way that political cultures and structures work to get a redistributive programme. You do not get a redistributive programme and leave politics alone as it is. And I think to briefly touch on the incentives for voters, I mentioned we had the lowest turnout. At 52% was the figure that came out today of the adult population. I think there's two main reasons for that. One is people kind of know that their vote doesn't make much of a difference. And the other is kind of an under-talked about part of this election was the intense polling. I think a poll of the UK population came out 3 times a day for the last 6 weeks. It was insane. And people knew what the outcome was going to be. They didn't feel like showing up to the ballot box made any difference because we kind of knew Keir Starmer was going to be the Prime Minister before a single vote was cast. And I think when you look at where votes count and where votes make a difference to who sits in Parliament, it's not a coincidence that those are places like Winchester or Hampshire, frankly. Most of the poorer regions in Liverpool are some of the places where 9 out of 10 votes don't make a difference to who sits in Parliament. That's not a coincidence, and you have to rewire that if you want to see this kind of redistributive programme. So that's kind of talking about the voting system, and that's primarily my job, so that's why I focus on that. And I do think that without changing how the House of Commons works, you won't change what it does. But the other policies that are mentioned in the book are reform of the Second Chamber, a planned integrated set of reforms to devolve power and get power out of Whitehall and Westminster, which include an overhaul of local government and taxes, but also how it works. And there's also a good few proposals in the books about ethics and standards reform that Labour should implement to prevent the level of scandal that we've seen in the last 5 years. We don't need any more contracts being handed out over WhatsApp. And just in an attempt to do this very quickly, I am going to mention one more thing, whenever we talk about democratic reform and the last election, or I don't know, the last week's been long, so not whenever we talk about it, but the last week, there's this Farage-shaped elephant in the room, and I just want to address that. The notion that reform or the far right would have gotten more power under a different voting system, they might have gotten more seats in this election. But the last 3, arguably 4 elections have been fought on Farage's terms, whether he stood down as candidates, whether he set the agenda. They already have an immense amount of power under first past the post, and there's no evidence that the politics as it is preventing their influence. And I think rewiring it to work for people, to represent average voters, gets us much closer to progressive ends than risks Farage's more influence on that. And just quickly, 2024 reform, their vote share was up by 2% from UKIP's height in 2015. This is a long-term problem that is not going away by panicking about it or by refusing to engage with the material circumstances and needs of people. We need to change how people think about politics, but also the structures of their lives. And that will help us way more than arguing about how many seats reform is second in and what that might mean in 5 years. If people need to see a politics that delivers for them, and if Farage is the only person promising that in the room, they will vote for them. And I'll just circle back to one more thing, which is the basic premise of ACT Now, which we saw bore out on Thursday, and also every bit of data tells us. Progressives can win on progressive platforms, but they can't do it in this political system. Every election apart from 2015, since 1979, there's been a majority of people in this country that have voted for broadly progressive parties, centre-left at least. There's no reason to think that would change under a different political system. People are crying out for that change, and if political parties promise it to them, they'll win under that platform and see change. So I'll finish there.
Thanks so much, Lena. We now have maybe a slightly curtailed Q&A session. I think what I'm going to do, rather than running madly around the room, is if you can give a relatively brief question, because we will try to fit in as many as possible, and I'll just summarise it for people on the stream. So do we have any questions around the room? Go ahead.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions. I haven't had the benefit of reading the book, so they may be covered. But in the presentations, I heard nothing about the potential of a land value tax, and I'd be really interested in hearing about panel's views about that in terms of making a contribution to redistribution. And secondly, it sounded that probably this programme depended on economic growth for some of the benefits. And again, I'd like to hear the panel's views in relation to how dependent it is on economic growth.
So that's about the potential of land value tax and why we didn't look at that specifically compared to a proportional property tax, and also the requirement to have growth to fund some of this. I'll just say with the second question, it's interesting because we've had this productivity puzzle, as Conservative-led governments have liked to phrase it for the last 14 years. And it's quite clear that what drives productivity very often is public investment that drives further private investment. And I think any system where you're going to try to get some growth, which every party has claimed to want to do, then you're going to have more public investment to drive that, to have the kind of infrastructure. For example, just trains to be able to get places. So getting a train, it's easier for me to drive than it is, cheaper for me to drive than it is to get a train. That's a ridiculous situation. But Howard, would you like to say anything on
I'll say a bit about
tax?
land value. I mean, land value tax is, if you like, land value is a component of wealth, and you could rely more heavily on land value tax than we chose to in the policy mix. I mean, it would be perfectly possible to have a higher, have a component of land value tax and then sort of downplay the rest of the wealth tax. The reason we didn't do that is because a lot of the inequalities in other forms of wealth, like financial wealth, have exploded in recent decades and we felt needed to be addressed. Also property wealth in general, not just land value, but the kind of building component of that. So that's why we had a more generalised wealth tax, but you could lean more heavily on land value tax, and I think that would be a very reasonable alternative.
And I mean, I think the thing is as well, we have room in this platform. There is room to tweak things.
Yeah.
You know, this is we've done an entire across-the-board kind of domestic policy suite, but there is room to tweak things as will be needed. And as you begin to have impacts, you'll have probably some differences from the projections, but we anticipate really quite big returns on investment. Did anyone else want to come in on that, or should we go to? Yeah. Okay, next question. Yes, please.
Hi, I appreciate the constraints of time, but I would like to refer to a bit more detail on certain key policies like social care. So, how are you going to not only redress but reverse, the sort of criminal standards of social care we now have? And my second question was, how are you going to get these ideas over to those who have the authority to make decisions on all the policy areas that you're talking about?
So that's about some of the health and social care policies and about implementation. And I think on the health and on the social care policies, I think the big thing that we say is that this just needs to be integrated properly with the NHS, that you can't have a system where patients are battered back and forth between health and social care as if they are totally independent of each other. So I think that's a really key aspect of it. But I think also that this is about investing in it as a far more cost-effective way of treating people with long-term conditions than them going into really emergency care every so often, and also just properly funding it so that carers can be paid properly. We're never going to have a system that works without carers being paid properly. So I think that's some of those initial bits. And about implementation, would anyone like to take how we intend to get this put into place?
I think Richard or Danny in particular talked about the vast number of Labour backbenchers that will exist in the next couple of years. And those Labour backbenchers really will be in trouble in 5 years' time if there hasn't been a transformative change to people's lives. We've got a health secretary, the prospective successor to Starmer, who has a majority of 500. He could quite easily lose his seat next time with an unpopular government in power. So the influence, I think, comes over the next couple of years in persuading a sufficient number of Labour backbenchers that this is in their direct electoral interests to endorse.
We tend to notice the very high-profile MPs but there are lots who've been around for a long time still, who this is it for them. And if you remember the beginning of 1997, and things can only get better, 2 years of sticking to Tory spending plans, but then some things happened, and you can argue about it, but they're not set to get that at the moment. There are also a Whitehall document listing a number of things that are possible or likely to go wrong. The melting down of the prison system, funding of universities when the A-level results are released next month. Universities get them on the 13th of August. The kids get them on the 15th. The schools get them on the 14th. That there are civil servants in the Department of Education and Business knowing that they've got that deadline to worry about what's happening to the universities. So things aren't going to be quiet. They haven't been quiet for the last 10 years. And they will need ideas at least to look for, argue for, say, why isn't that possible? Why can't we do that? It would be great then to try to find a way. It's always called the summer reading list, and they will be heading off to summer. I don't know, is there a way of getting this, first of all to those MPs, but people more generally, just saying, do not believe that there is no alternative. We were once told before that there was no alternative. We know what we got because of that. But it's keeping alive the idea that you don't have to do it this way. You can look at the rest of Europe to see almost every the Netherlands, Germany, certainly France, Belgium, they're all spending at this level and taxing at this level. There are 5 Nordic countries that are remarkably equal now, but there's another 5 countries in Europe that are more equal than those. And Germany and France are almost as equitable as Finland, Norway and Sweden. So this is all happening very, very close to us in Europe. Being told it's just not impossible, it's just not possible, that this is some kind of fantasy economics, as if we didn't behave better in our own past than people aren't. But it's that. It's the agitating and arguing for it. And if you didn't have a book like this, and you didn't have these costings, you have to end up arguing on your own again. So you need a group of people to come together who know about different things. As Alison Pollock was involved in the health and social care part. And you have to work together in larger communities. And people are going to have to start doing that in the political parties as well more. There are 4 Green MPs. We've never had that many. Most of Europe, of course, has many more. We have more independent MPs than we've had, I think, for 100 years. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do, but we've got 4 of those. We've got a nice old man in Islington who almost became father of the house bar 1 hour, which he could then join with the new mother of the house. You know who the mother of the house is? Diane, yeah. Yeah. There is a battle at the moment. We're going to be told that there's a grown-up politics, and anybody who says that you could do any differently to what we may be about to get doesn't understand the grown-up politics. And I think we need to get that thrown out of the window within months rather than 2 or 3 years, and say, grow up yourselves. It's very, very serious. We have rising child mortality for the first time since the 1930s. Our children this year are more likely to die than children last year. The heights of children have been falling since the births of 2005. Stunted, on average, getting shorter. Not in Germany, not in France, just here. My job used to be difficult. In the 90s, I had to work out complicated social statistics to say that things were bad. Measure the heights of the children. They were getting shorter during Sure Start. Don't just tell me, we'll reenact that wonderful new Labour government. It wasn't that great. And it's that's the kind of thing you need, and not to believe being told this just isn't possible. When we did it before, and it's what most of the mainland of Europe is currently doing in terms of taxing and spending.
And I'll just add as well that this is a plea that we're not making any profit out of this book. If you buy it and it becomes more popular, it becomes more difficult to ignore. So that's the thing. But go to the website at the very least. Go to commonsensepolicygroup.com. You can look at all of the policy areas. If you like what you see, then buy the book. And if we get this in enough people's hands, then suddenly it becomes a sensible policy platform that everyone should adopt.
It's only £5 on Kindle.
Exactly.
My whole job is convincing MPs to do something that maybe they don't want to do. And I think there's 2 things I'd say to how do we implement this. One is the honeymoon period of this government is going to be very short, and there are lots of crises coming down the line at them, and whatever brittle centralising politics that they currently run will not work under those crises and systems if they don't have a broad, deep alliance base of thinkers and people around them and allies. And those will be opportunities for us to point to this book again and say, we've done this particular piece of work for this area of where this crisis is. And the second thing is, Starmer, for all his faults, this whole No Ideology Act, he's a manager. He's more likely than someone entrenched in a faction or an ideology, I would say, than to change his mind based on there's a crisis, there's evidence something else works, we're going to try something else. So you might not like his current strategy, and there's plenty of problems with it, but I think ultimately we do have to admit he learned how to game the system incredibly well, again with reform's benefit, but he won. And we have to show up the electoral cost of the long-term plan of that, but also use the crises that come down the line as opportunities to kind of get into that and say, you will not get 400 seats next time. So let's get round to actually fixing some of those problems.
I think we can do one more question. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, I suppose I'm a concern that one of the things that provides public services with a means of investment is the fact that we conflate structure with method. So if you were to provide more investment in public services, there's a danger you're paying people better and getting more of them to act episodically and transactionally. There's something here about being relational, because relational public services are more effective and save money. So it is about getting more supply, more money, but it's about using it better and wasting less and being displaying far greater levels of efficacy, particularly with the people that are the most disadvantaged, because that's when you get the biggest results by deploying a different method. If all of this remains purely around structural integration, you just do the wrong thing with more money. So it's a plea, really. I'm a director at a local authority, and the work that we do is moving from transactional to relational, and that it's incumbent on us to do that no matter how much money we do and don't get. So I suppose something in here around understanding the need for a better structure and integration of health and social care, but not relying on it, because on its own it won't work.
So that's a question about how things are run under a system that is given more money. And I think the first thing is, yes, things have to be run effectively, and we've seen in the past that some industries, when they were nationalised, weren't run very effectively. So I think there should be an acknowledgement of that, and I think it's a big question about how you run things in that context. But I don't think anyone would argue that all public services need more funding. And there is no ability to talk about these kinds of things if they don't have the funding to have the space to do this stuff. Would anyone like to come in on that side of things, how you might run something?
Well, I'll start where you're thinking. No, I agree. It's really easy to waste money. And there's some kind of odd opportunity here, because we've cut and cut and cut and cut. We've decimated public sector employment down. So, little city I live in, 150,000 people, called Oxford. It's got just under 600 people working for the council now. The School of Geography and Environment I work in, we're 500 and rising. My academic department's going to have more employees than the people keeping the city running, because the bins are arm's length now.
Yeah, we've lost 40%.
Yeah. So you can just about keep a city just going with a skeletal staff. When you decide not to do that, to actually have a few more people, you don't need to recreate what you have in the past. You could do something different. But it just all has to be decided locally. You don't want it impinged from above. And then if you muck it up locally, you muck it up locally and you waste money. But we cut things down so to the bone that there is opportunity to actually be efficient, because any inefficiency is long, long, long gone.
The key is efficacy, it's not efficiency. By focusing on efficiency, you end up doing the wrong thing right. So we need to figure out efficacy. I think what austerity has done is it's created an efficiency mindset. Let's do more with less. Rather than do better things, we're just trying to do things better.
I'll give you one example about not knowing. 2018, my local authority issued antisocial behaviour orders against homeless people in Oxford. And then they were told and worked out that the majority of homeless people dying in the city had grown up in the city. This wasn't opportunist people coming in to beg for money. It's because now all that work, issuing the antisocial behaviours orders, paid for by council tax, was just counterproductive, stupid and nasty.
And 85% of them would have been in care, and all that money was wasted too.
Yeah. And when they're released from the prisons, which is wasted, they're given a tent by a charity, which, it's shameful. But but we know about this, we don't have to keep on getting it wrong.
I agree. It's a method issue.
But I think really crucially it is a resource issue as well. And I think you can. It's got to the point where no matter how well you do things, you can't do it successfully now. So I think, it's interesting. As a personal story, I used to have a nightmare about calling the police and not being able to get through. And that was alleviated when I called the police and could get through. Having said that, I did that a couple of years ago and I was on a 10-minute wait. So that was on 999. So you've got this situation where police can do whatever to reform the structure and to behave like humans who interact well with each other, but there just aren't enough. So I think to give people space to do it, it's really crucial that we have that resource and also then talk about how you can do things better. So I'll close now because I think this is about accessibility, and I think it's important that we keep things to a reasonable length as well. And I think to say that the experience of the last 14 years, building on more like 40 years overall of penny-wise, pound-foolish policy, has shown that such approaches cannot address the issues we face today, many of which have been highlighted by today's speakers. Last week I was on BBC Radio Newcastle and teased to provide election analysis. On Thursday night, as the exit poll came out, it was clear that the new government had achieved a landslide in terms of seats won. But there were also early hints that the new government's position may actually be more precarious than that seat total appeared. While the Conservatives achieved their worst ever result, they weren't pushed into a potential third place that many of the polls were predicting. On Friday afternoon, it became clear that Labour had lost more than 500,000 votes compared with their disastrous performance in 2019 and only gained 1.8 percentage points in vote share. The government has an opportunity to act with that huge majority, but the time in which it can do so is short. These years tick by, these days, years, months tick by very quickly. The primary reason for its victory this time, in addition to that gaming of the system, was a massive split on the political right that hasn't been there before. And this will likely not reoccur in 2029. The Conservative Party in particular are very good at uniting. That's something that's happened a number of times. To avoid a reversal at the next election, similar to that just experienced by the now opposition, and a return to the policies that have left Britain in crisis, the government must make a real, substantial and swift difference to people's everyday lives. That can only be achieved through public investment and bold policy on the scale of 1945's transformative programme built on the Beveridge Report. The US government invested hundreds of billions of dollars in green energy and jobs through the Inflation Reduction Act and is already seeing the returns. As in 1945, when the Labour Party committed to implementing the large-scale public investment proposed by Beveridge, the new government must commit to adopting the feasible, affordable and popular policies we've set out to rebuild the nation. To secure a decade of national renewal, it must act now. Thank you.
That's okay.